So I think it is helpful to think of this essay, let's just call it an essay, in three parts. A short introduction, which says some very key things about philosophy and what philosophers do. A second part, which is a description of the so-called common sense view of things. The common sense answer, I should say, to the question what there is in the universe. And then a third part where he discusses the way in which that common sense answer is challenged or contradicted in some cases by some very famous philosophers, and maybe all philosophers to some extent. Let's talk about that common sense view. Remember, the common sense view is an answer to what he calls the most basic of all philosophical questions, and or maybe the most basic of all philosophical tasks, and that is, as he says, giving a general description of the whole universe. Um, why he actually does this in these terms, that is, why he thinks it would be helpful to present the so-called common sense view and then to contrast it with the view of many philosophers. That's a good question. I think it's very clear, I should say, in my opinion, that More is criticizing official philosophy for its contradictions of common sense. That clearly More believes that common sense, when it bothers to think about the question of what there is in the universe, has some pretty secure and substantial and reliable, I should say, answers to that question. And the basic answer of common sense is what? As we see that there are at least two sorts of things in the world, one of which is material objects, and he goes to some pains to say exactly what that means. Not exactly, but some pains to say towards saying what that means for something to be a material object. And the second is what he calls acts of consciousness, or acts of conscious mind, I think he calls it. I can't remember. I'll get to it. Mental acts of consciousness, he calls them. And one of the things to keep in mind is that he believes that common sense believes that these things exist in the world, that there are material objects that exist in space, which are independent of us, which are all related to each other in certain geometric ways. That is, that they are all in space and they are all definite distances from each other, and that there is perhaps something called space, which is a different question, I guess, whether there are objects in space, and then the question of what space exactly is. Similar to time, we say that things happen in time, but what exactly time is a metaphysical question. But the thing is, they're all metaphysical questions. The question of what there is in the universe is a metaphysical question, because if we remember what metaphysics basically is, it's an attempt to describe the basic structure of reality, and certainly part of that, the basic structure of reality, is sort of what sort of things actually exist in the world, and saying that material objects exist and mental acts of consciousness exist is doing metaphysics. Now, saying that space and time exist it's also doing metaphysics, in the sense that you're trying to describe the basic underlying structure of reality. For instance, to say that, let's say, the atom exists, or that electrons exist, that's not a metaphysical question, it's a scientific question. Because you're saying that one particular thing exists or doesn't exist in the universe. But you're not saying that a kind of thing. If an electron exists, then it is a particular thing. But to say that material objects exist is a different sort of claim, because you're saying that then a whole class of things, which presumably include electrons, I guess, exist. And that's a metaphysical question. To say that I don't know, that the War of 1812 was fought between the Americans and the Europeans is not a metaphysical question. It's a particular historical, empirical question. To say, for instance, that events in the past still have some reality, that would be a metaphysical question, right? Because you're going to the more basic philosophical issue underneath any empirical question. So it's clear, if you read this common sense view of things, you may or may not agree with it. I mean, I don't know if all the things there are true. What he seems to be saying is that, well, this is what we all, or most of us, believe about the universe, that there are material objects, that they exist in space, that there are mental acts of consciousness which are somehow attached to our bodies. Now that's another issue, right? One of the questions I asked you in the assessment is whether Moore believes that mental acts of consciousness take place in the brain. The answer to that is no. I'll give you the answer now. He never goes as far as to say that. He does go so far as to say that mental acts of consciousness are somehow attached. Now what attached means in this case, because it certainly doesn't mean physically attached, because they're not physical things, but they are somehow attached to bodies, and bodies of a certain sort. That is, that most material objects, we all believe, he says, don't think. They don't have acts of consciousness. Only very particular bodies are associated with acts of consciousness, and that would be living bodies like ours, and perhaps, he says, other types of animal. So again, you don't have to agree with this. I mean, he says that common sense believes that these two types of thing exist, that they have a certain relation to each other, that is, mental acts of consciousness are somehow always attached to living bodies. Not all bodies are living, and therefore not all bodies are capable of producing or somehow or another being associated with these mental acts of consciousness. He goes on to say certain things about God, that the common sense view is that we don't know if God exists, right? There's another assessment question. I mean, if you read that, he says, common sense does not say that God definitely exists, and common sense does not say that God definitely does not exist. And that's important, because Moore is saying that common sense believes that certain things exist, but it doesn't believe that these are definitely all the things that exist, right? And here he thinks that common sense does differ from a lot of philosophers who believe not only that, okay, these sort of things exist, but these are the only sort of things that exist, and they try to prove that. Common sense, he says, has no interest in that, in doing that. Common sense says, well, of course there are material objects, and they're sort of like this. And common sense says, well, of course there are mental acts of consciousness, thoughts, perceptions, ideas, and stuff, and they're sort of like this. But it's silent about whether there are other things. It says, well, maybe there are other things, but I don't know, because I don't have any proof, and there's no obvious right or wrong answer to say to the question whether there's an afterlife, the question whether there is a God, things like that. Well, those things could exist, but I don't know if they exist. There's no real evidence for or against, I think, is what Moore's view of common sense is. I would say the last thing I'd like to say about his, well, at least for this video, about his view of common sense is that common sense believes that there are certain types of things in the world, material objects, mental acts of consciousness. Moreover, it believes that it knows that these things exist. That is, it doesn't just sort of say, well, maybe there are these things. It basically says, I know. I know that I know that there are material objects. I know that there are mental acts of consciousness. That's a very important thing, because of course philosophers can and do challenge that claim to know. And maybe we could talk about Russell here in Appearance and Reality. I mean, Russell believed that we do have mental acts of consciousness in the sense we have sensations and we are aware of sense data. But he believed that the belief that there are material objects that correspond to those sense data that was an inference that we made, and that it could be wrong. So I don't know if Russell and Moore would really disagree on this point ultimately, but at least on the evidence of appearance and reality versus what is philosophy, it would seem that Russell is much more open to the idea that there are no material objects. Although, interestingly, both of these authors criticize Bishop Berkeley, the idealist, for saying that there are no material objects. Um, Neither of them give any kind of knockdown, drag-out argument to this effect, but both of them seem to resist that idea. That definitely Moore, who believes in common sense, who believes that the common sense view of things is sound, and the common sense view of things is that there are material objects and mental acts of consciousness, and any philosophy, therefore, that denied, as Moore describes Berkeley as denying, that there are material objects, is a contradiction of common sense.